I had always dreamed of going on a cruise. The idea of traveling the open sea, leaving behind the busy city life and the stress of work, sounded perfect. The cruise was meant to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a chance to relax, see beautiful sunsets, and maybe even meet some interesting people along the way. When my friend Dan called me with an offer I couldn't refuse, I didn't hesitate. "Come on, it's all-inclusive, 7 nights. We'll be on the Majesty, one of the finest ships on the ocean. You're not gonna pass this up, are you?" Dan's voice was buzzing with excitement. The Majesty was a legendary ship. People said it was practically a floating city. It had everything you could imagine: gourmet restaurants, pools, theaters, shops, spas, and even an indoor ice skating rink. The brochures showed glamorous photos of people sipping cocktails on the deck, basking in the sun, and enjoying the luxurious life at sea. I couldn't wait. Finally, the day arrived. When we boarded, I was stunned. The ship was even larger and more beautiful than I had imagined. Shiny marble floors stretched out before us, with sparkling chandeliers hanging from the ceilings. Crew members in crisp uniforms greeted us, and other passengers bustled around with excitement. As we set sail, I felt a thrill rush through me. This was it, the beginning of an unforgettable journey. But I had no idea just how unforgettable it would become. The first night was perfect. After exploring the ship, Dan and I joined a few other friends we'd met for dinner at one of the fancy restaurants. We laughed, ate delicious food, and enjoyed the ocean view through the massive windows. Later, there was a live music performance in the lounge, and we stayed out late, soaking up the luxury and fun. By the time I got back to my cabin, it was well past midnight. My room was cozy, with soft sheets on the bed and a small porthole window where I could see the ocean waves glistening in the moonlight. I crawled into bed, exhausted but happy, and closed my eyes, ready for a good night's sleep. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something. It was a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the room. I opened my eyes, listening carefully. The sound was so soft, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, a faint, almost pleading voice. "Help?" And I sat up, my heart racing. The room was dark, and I could see nothing but shadows. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the voice was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the sound of the ship's engines. I lay back down, but my mind wouldn't let go of the eerie feeling that had settled over me. It took a long time for me to fall asleep. The next day was filled with activities. The ship had planned excursions, and we went to a small island where we snorkeled and explored the beautiful coral reefs. The ocean was clear and blue, and I started to feel like I was finally relaxing. I managed to forget about the strange voice from the night before, but that evening, as I was walking back to my cabin alone, I found myself in a part of the ship I didn't recognize. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, with old-fashioned wallpaper peeling from the walls. The air felt thick, and there was a damp, musty smell that seemed out of place on such a grand ship. I turned a corner, and there, at the end of the hallway, was an old door slightly ajar. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and a strange draft of cold air seeped out from the crack. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to turn back, but another part of me was curious. I stepped closer, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was dark, but I could make out rows of dusty wooden chairs and a small stage at the front. It looked like an old theater, with red velvet curtains hanging limply on the sides. The walls were covered in faded posters, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper. The whole place felt abandoned, like it had been forgotten for years. As I stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine, and then, from somewhere inside the room, I heard it again. "Help? Me." The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a wave of fear through me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I didn't dare go inside. I turned and walked quickly back to my cabin, my mind racing with questions. Why was there an abandoned theater on the ship, and who or what was calling for help? The next morning, I was determined to find some answers. At breakfast, I asked one of the older crew members if he knew anything about the theater on the lower deck. He looked at me with a strange expression. "You went down there?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Yeah, I found it by accident," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I heard a voice. The crew member glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer. "That part of the ship is supposed to be closed off. No one's allowed down there. That theater, it's part of the old ship. You see, the Majesty was built on the remains of an older ship to Tat. Well, there was an accident, a fire. Many lives were lost. He paused, his eyes dark and serious. Some people say the souls of those who died in the fire are still here, trapped on this ship, unable to find peace. A chill ran down my spine. I thanked him and walked away, my mind racing. If what he said was true, then the voice I'd heard. Could it have been one of those lost souls, still calling for help after all these years? That night, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard the voice again. This time, it was louder, clearer. Help me. I sat up, my heart pounding. The voice was coming from somewhere outside my cabin. I got out of bed, opened the door, and looked down the hallway. It was empty, silent, and dark. But the voice was still there, calling to me. Help. Mem. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing through the silent corridor. The voice led me back down to the lower deck, to that same abandoned theater. The door was open, and the room was dark and cold, like stepping into a freezer. And then I saw her. A woman was sitting in one of the seats, her head bowed, her hair covering her face. She looked pale, almost translucent, as if she was made of smoke. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were empty, hollow, and her face was twisted in pain. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Then slowly, she raised her hand and pointed to the stage. I turned to look, and for a split second, I saw something. Flames flickering in the darkness, and shadows of people running, screaming. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the woman's expression was one of pure terror. She opened her mouth again, and this time, her voice was clear. "Help me. I'm trapped. Please." I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, so strong that it brought tears to my eyes. I wanted to help her, to do something, but I didn't know how. Before I could say anything, she vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. Over the next few days, I tried to find more information about the fire, but none of the other crew members would talk about it. My friends started to notice that something was wrong, but I didn't want to scare them. I knew they wouldn't believe me anyway. On the last night of the cruise, the voice returned, louder and more desperate than ever. It was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. "Help me, please, help me." I ran out of my cabin, following the voice down to the lower deck. The abandoned theater was open, and this time it was filled with smoke. I could hear the crackling of flames, the screams of people trapped inside. And there she was, standing on the stage, her face twisted in agony, reaching out to me. I tried to run toward her, but the smoke was too thick. I could feel the heat of the flames, the suffocating weight of the smoke, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. I was standing in an empty room, the theater silent and dark. The woman was gone, but her voice lingered in my mind, echoing over and over. The next morning, I left the ship without looking back. I knew I'd never set foot on a cruise ship again. But even now, months later, I can still hear her voice, calling to me in the dead of night. "Help me." My name is Nate, and last year, I was a deckhand on the Horizon Star, a luxury cruise ship. Most people think working on a cruise ship is a dream job. Endless sun, drinks, new places every week. It sounds perfect. But that cruise taught me that even the middle of the ocean isn't safe from what haunts us. The Horizon Star was on a 2-week journey, a round trip from Miami through the Caribbean islands and back. We had over 1,000 passengers on board, plus a huge crew. I was part of a small team assigned to night shifts. Most of my duties involved cleaning up after the late-night parties, securing the deck, and making sure everything was in order for the next day. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me some peace and quiet. On the third night of the cruise, something strange happened. A thick fog settled over the water. I'd seen fog at sea before, but this fog was different. It was dense, like a wall around the ship. The sea was calm, too calm, and the usual hum of the engine felt muted. The ship itself seemed to move slower, like it was pushing against something unseen. My first task that night was to check the observation deck, a glass-walled area at the top of the ship where guests could watch the stars. No one was up there. It was deserted. As I walked past the glass walls, I saw something that made me stop. A handprint. It was smeared on the glass from the inside, with long fingers and claw-like tips. It looked nothing like a normal handprint. I knew I hadn't seen it earlier when I checked the area, and I couldn't imagine any guest leaving a print like that. Goosebumps crept up my arms, but I told myself it was probably just a smudge. I grabbed a cloth and wiped it clean, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The rest of my shift passed uneventfully, but the image of that handprint stuck with me. I shrugged it off as best as I could and went to bed at dawn trying to get some sleep. But that night would be only the beginning. The next night, the fog was still there, thicker than before. It was so dense that I could barely see past the railings. As I made my rounds, I kept hearing sounds, soft whispers, like voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the other crew members, but the sounds didn't come from any particular direction. They seemed to echo all around me. Around 2 a.m., I was walking down one of the empty passenger corridors. The guests were all asleep or in their cabins. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned, expecting to see someone there, but the corridor was empty. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, getting closer. I backed up, my heart pounding. There was nowhere to go. The steps stopped just a few feet away from me. I felt something cold pass by, like a draft, though all the doors were closed. The air around me grew colder and I could see my breath. I radioed my supervisor, Darren, who was on the lower deck. "Darren," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is anyone else on this floor?" There was a long pause. "Negative, Nate. You're the only one assigned up there." "Why? You all right?" I hesitated. I didn't want him to think I was losing it. "Yeah, just check." After that, I finished my shift as quickly as I could. The sense of unease had only grown. I could still feel the cold from where I'd heard those footsteps. The following nights got stranger. The fog never lifted, and I started to hear whispers every time I was on deck. They weren't clear, just faint murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I began seeing shadows too, dark shapes at the edge of my vision that would disappear as soon as I looked. One night, I was walking near the ship's pool. It was closed off with a rope, and no guests were allowed in that area after midnight. As I walked past, I saw something move in the water. At first, I thought it was just a ripple, but then I saw it again, a shadow, something large and dark moving under the surface. I stared, trying to make sense of it, and then it rose just enough that I could make out a face, pale and distorted, staring up at me. I stumbled back, heart racing, and blinked. When I looked again, the pool was empty. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but I knew what I'd seen. The next morning, I tried to talk to some of the other crew members. I didn't tell them exactly what I'd seen, but I asked if they'd noticed anything strange. Most of them just laughed it off, saying I was just tired or imagining things. But one of the older deckhands, Luis, looked at me seriously. "Be careful," he said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "This ship has a history. Strange things have happened on these waters. Don't wander alone at night." I wanted to ask him more, but he walked away before I could press him. By the 7th night, I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face in the pool, or the handprint on the glass, or those shadows at the edge of my vision. I began to dread my shifts, especially the ones where I was alone. One night, I was working in the engine room, deep in the belly of the ship. The hum of the engines usually drowned out all other sounds, but that night, I heard something over the noise, a low guttural moan. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the metal walls. I looked around, but there was no one else there. The moaning turned into a wail, a desperate, agonized cry that sent chills down my spine. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound seemed to seep into my bones, vibrating through the floor and walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. I ran out of the engine room, not caring if I looked like a coward. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted off that ship. When I finally saw Darren, I told him everything. The handprint, the footsteps, the face in the pool, the voices. He listened quietly, his face unreadable. "You're not the first, you know," he said when I finished. "I've been on this ship for 5 years, and every now and then someone sees things that shouldn't be there." "Why doesn't anyone talk about it?" I asked, feeling a surge of frustration. "Would you book a ticket on a haunted ship?" he asked with a grim smile. "They keep it quiet. But people have disappeared on these waters, and sometimes they come back." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I didn't want to find out. The last night of the cruise was the worst. The fog had lifted, but the air felt heavy, charged, like the calm before a storm. I was on deck, watching the horizon, counting down the hours until we reached Miami. That's when I saw her. A woman in a long, dark dress stood at the edge of the deck, her back to me. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. I called out to her, telling her the deck was closed, but she didn't move. I approached slowly, keeping my distance. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She turned to face me, and I felt my blood run cold. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and dark. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. And then she smiled. A twisted, unnatural smile that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, she stepped over the railing and vanished into the water below. I rushed to the edge, looking down, but there was no splash, no sign of her at all. She was just gone. I stumbled back, breathing heavily. I could still see her face in my mind, that terrible, empty smile. The next morning, we docked in Miami, and I left the ship as soon as I could. I didn't even say goodbye to the other crew members. I just wanted to get as far away from the horizon star as possible. To this day, I still see her face in my nightmares. I hear the whispers, feel the cold touch of that strange presence. I don't know what it was, or why it chose to show itself to me. But one thing is certain, there are places in this world where the line between the living and the dead grows thin. And sometimes, in the heart of the ocean, those lines blur until there's no telling who or what you might find waiting for you in the fog. I had always wanted to go on a cruise. The idea of spending a week on the open ocean, eating good food, and seeing new places was something I had dreamed about for years. So when I received an invitation in the mail for a free ticket aboard the Sea Voyager, I couldn't believe my luck. The letter didn't explain much, but it promised an all-expenses-paid cruise, so I eagerly packed my bags and set off for the docks. The letter didn't mention why it was free, but I didn't question it. I dialed the number on the bottom of the letter and spoke to a calm voice on the other end. "Your exclusive cruise has been confirmed. Please arrive at the dock by 2 p.m. sharp. The ship departs at 3 p.m., the voice said. Excited, I arrived at the docks. The Sea Voyager was a massive ship, towering over the other boats in the harbor. It had sleek, modern lines, and everything about it looked perfect. As I boarded, a crew member greeted me with a polite smile and checked my name off a list. "Welcome aboard," he said. "We're glad to have you with us." The ship was grand, with every luxury you could imagine. There were pools, a casino, a gym, and even a theater. The decks were filled with passengers, most of whom were sitting quietly, sipping drinks or looking out over the ocean. I waved it off as the calm nature of a cruise. After all, people were there to relax, not make a lot of noise. As the ship set sail, I felt the excitement build inside me. The city shrank behind us, and soon the vast open ocean stretched out in every direction. But something felt odd. The passengers around me were mostly quiet, and they didn't seem to be interacting with one another. At dinner, there were long silences between people, and no one seemed to talk much. I tried to strike up a conversation with a man sitting at the table next to mine. He looked around my age, and he had the same look of uncertainty in his eyes. "It's my first cruise," I said, smiling. He smiled back, but there was something strange about it. His lips didn't move as naturally as they should, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, mine too," he replied, his voice flat. He didn't ask any questions or continue the conversation, just stared at his food. I didn't know why, but it made me feel uneasy. That night, I decided to explore the ship a little. I walked around the main deck, passing by a few passengers who were standing near the railing, staring out at the ocean. None of them were talking to each other. They were all just staring ahead with empty eyes. It was like they were lost in their thoughts. I passed by the casino and saw a woman sitting at a slot machine, her eyes fixed on the screen. She didn't blink or look away for even a second. Her face was pale, and she seemed unaware of the people around her. I tried to ask if everything was okay, but she didn't answer. I left her and continued walking, but the feeling of unease grew stronger. The next morning, I woke up early to watch the sunrise. I stepped outside onto the deck, where I noticed the same passengers from the night before, standing at the railings and staring at the water. No one was talking, no one was laughing, just silence. I tried to talk to a man who was standing nearby, someone I hadn't seen before. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me blankly for a moment before finally saying, "Yes, a nice day." But there was no warmth in his voice. He didn't smile. He just turned and walked away, as if he hadn't said anything. Something was definitely wrong with the passengers on this ship. They were all acting strangely, and no one seemed to want to interact with me or anyone else. It was as if they were all in some sort of trance. Later that day, I passed by the dining room and noticed a woman who had always sat at the same table for every meal. She wasn't there. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the day went on, I started to realize that a lot of people were missing. I tried to ask one of the crew members, but he simply told me that some passengers preferred to stay in their cabins. But it didn't feel right. As the days passed, I noticed that more and more people seemed to disappear. At breakfast, the room would be full, but by lunch, the place would be nearly empty. I wandered around the ship looking for someone to talk to, but I couldn't find anyone. The corridors were quiet. The lounges were empty. I began to feel more and more like I was the only person on board. I went to the crew, hoping they could explain what was happening. I found one of them standing by the deck, looking out at the water. "Excuse me," I said. "Where is everyone? Why are so many people missing?" The crew member didn't even turn to face me. He simply spoke without emotion. "It's nothing to worry about. Just enjoy your trip." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I decided to let it go. Maybe I was just overreacting. The ship was big and maybe people were just off doing their own thing, but something didn't feel right. That night, I saw the woman who had been missing for the past few days. She was standing near the railing, staring out at the water. I walked toward her, wanting to ask if she was okay. But when I got close, I froze. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't blinking. She stood completely still, as if she had no awareness of the world around her. Her face was pale, and her skin looked strange, almost as if she wasn't alive. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I shook her gently by the shoulder, but still, there was no reaction. And then I noticed something that made my heart stop. Her reflection in the glass railing wasn't the same as her real face. In the reflection, she was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong to her. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could react, I turned to find the rest of the passengers standing nearby, staring at me with those same empty, lifeless eyes. They didn't speak, but they all seemed to be watching me. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they turned away and disappeared into the ship. I didn't know what was happening. I felt trapped, surrounded by people who didn't seem real. I tried to find my way back to my cabin, but the ship felt like it was getting bigger and bigger. The hallways twisted and turned, and I started to wonder if I had lost my way completely. The next morning, I woke up and realized something was terribly wrong. The ship had not moved. We had been sailing for days, but we hadn't reached any ports. The horizon was still the same, and the ocean stretched out endlessly. It was like we were stuck in a place where time didn't exist. I asked the crew what was going on, but they didn't give me any answers. They just smiled in that same strange way and told me to enjoy the cruise. No one seemed worried, and no one seemed to notice that we were lost. It was as if we were stuck in a never-ending journey, with no destination. I tried to leave the ship, but every time I went to the deck, the lifeboats were gone. The lifeboats, the escape, everything had vanished. Days turned into weeks, and I started to lose track of time. No one spoke, no one moved. The ship continued sailing, but we never reached land. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare where I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I've been here, but I'm writing this down now in the hope that someone will find it. If you're reading this, don't ever get on the Sea Voyager. It's not a cruise ship, it's a prison. And once you're aboard, you'll never leave. The ship will never dock, and neither will you.